I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean Detloff, a PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies and the co-director of the Detnico Center for Christianity and Socialism.
And I'm Matt Bernico, a PhD haver and also co-member of the Detnico. I think that's okay that my name comes last in this one, but otherwise I might be mad about it. The Detnico Center for Christianity and Socialism. Here we are. We're really doing it. And John, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is John Thornton Jr. I'm a co-pastor of Jubilee Baptist Church and a champion of the Detnico Center for Christianity and Socialism.
An honorary fellow.
An honorary fellow.
Some people have to pay a lot of money for that.
Yeah, no, yeah. I think that, the champions, I prefer the term champion. That's the
yeah. You're right. We don't hire honorary fellows. We hire champions to fight for us in the battle of public discourse.
Owning the libs, but from the other side.
That's right. Exactly. Glad to have you on board as one of our champions. One of our many Davids against the Goliaths of capitalism. Well, thanks for coming back, John. For folks who are longtime Magnificast listeners, you've met John several times before. If you're not a longtime listener, you can listen to all our New Year's episodes because John always comes back. But we've got him back early this year. Don't worry, he will come back for the new year. But we have him back early because there's some big news that only John can help us think about that we will get to later in the show, which is the establishment of the Falkirk Center. Don't worry, we'll tell you all about it. But before we get there, John, you've had a really wild year. The last time that you were on the show, it was the beginning of this year, and you were just getting ready to launch with co-pastors Jubilee Baptist Church. And now that you're a bit further along with that, could you give us an update? Maybe we could just sort of start the conversation about the left and what y'all are doing, and we'll get into everything starting there.
Yeah. So last time we talked, I think I was still living in Winston-Salem, which is where I worked at the church I was working at previously, but was moving to Durham to be a part of a church replant in Chapel Hill. So we Jubilee Baptist Church, we're a church replant of Ephesus Baptist Church, which was founded in 1891. And about a year ago, realized that they had come to the end of their life as a church and needed to do something pretty drastically new. And so that meant hiring a couple new pastors in addition to their senior pastor, my friend Kevin at Rev Kev Geo, who I think is people should follow. He's very funny, a really good writer.
That's a good one.
Yeah, friend of the pod. And we'll but yeah, we were sort of moving towards that, and so we have in that time since the first of the year, really since November of a year ago, moved towards this replant. And so in September, we launched as a new church, meeting regularly for worship. People keep showing up, and we'll keep doing it until they stop. But one of the things, we do a couple of things. So the way we phrase it is we worship, gather, struggle, and liberate. So I think worship is relatively self-evident that but I mean, it's self-evident, but also like, it's not a given at this point in churches. So we worship God, the triune Lord. We're not trying to trick anybody into thinking that we're like a coffee shop, and then they get there and they're like, "Are you guys a church?" Like, I think this feels a lot like a
Pretty
church.
disappointing.
And I'm from like suburban Dallas, that's like a more common thing than you would expect. We gather, which means we eat together, we read together, we talk together. So we're recording this a few hours after I got dinner with some congregants, and we got together and talked about Herbert McCabe's Christian Love the class struggle in Christian Love. We struggle, which means that we recognize that not everybody comes to our church with fully formed beliefs about God, and that faith is oftentimes a struggle. And we also recognize that there are real struggles, like the class struggle. So people may come to our church believing theologically in many of the same ways that we do, but they also are dealing with the fact that they're in debt, that their employer is exploiting them, dealing with things like sexual harassment, infrequent scheduling, like racist discrimination, those sorts of things. And like that those are very real struggles that we have to respond to as a church. And then we liberate. And so one of the way we do that, I think most pointedly, is that we pay off each other's debts. So built into our budget as a church is a fund for $25,000 a year that we use to pay off somebody's debt once a month. And we focus particularly on members as a way of saying, like, this is a problem that all of us have. And this is we are not as a church going out to help somebody outside. Like, the way we understand this is not how do we go help people that are in debt outside the church, but our understanding is we are all in debt and we have to help each other, and this is the way that we do it. So yeah, that's kind of what we do. And then but we're also like a very normal church in that we have a budget, we have quarterly church conferences, we have columns and a steeple, like we're in some ways very, very normal, but the direction that we're going, I think it's interesting to me. And that's, so that's Jubilee Baptist.
Well, John, you're the pastor of what is perhaps the only good church that I've ever heard of. It's so wild that you guys focus on debt like you do. I think that's the most interesting thing in the world. But before we talk more about the debt stuff, which is something I want to get to, how do other folks, like other Baptist churches, how do they respond to you? Like, do you guys, I don't know what the ecclesial hierarchy is of Baptist churches, probably not much, but do other folks think that you're really peculiar, or like, how does that work out?
Well, the weird thing about being Baptist, and it's especially weird, and I have to clarify this with every person I talk to in the South, especially. The weird thing about being Baptist is that the only thing we have in common is that we have nothing in common, or that we don't necessarily have anything in common, right? Like, is that the only thing we have in common is that our churches determine our lives to get like what the congregation senses and understands God calling us to is what we do. So at least right now, we're just doing what we think we ought to do. We are a part of the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, which is a larger, their term for it is a denom-network.
Nice.
Yeah. Yeah. And they, the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, of which I've been a part, a long time, and which our church is very happy to support, and to be a part of. Moved out of the Southern Baptist Convention in the 80s. So the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship is 27 years old, 26 years old. And this is about the time where the Southern Baptists like made this hard move to the right, both theologically and politically. So, I would say the CBF is in some ways kind of confused, but also open in really interesting ways. In that there's a real aversion to telling any congregation what they ought to do based on how the Southern Baptists did just that. Like the Southern Baptists basically in the 80s, for listeners, the Southern Baptists in the 80s into the 90s made this hard right move and basically had these like faith statements, all this stuff, and said, if you are not on board with this hard right theological political move, you are out of the convention, which was a way of relating to other congregations. And the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship was birthed out of a reaction to that, and which has advantages and disadvantages, because it can be helpful to tell congregations, oh, we're not going to associate with you over this matter. But for us, it's an advantage because like we get to do what we want. We're an autonomous congregation, but we also get to associate with churches that are pretty like-minded and that have this sort of moderate to sometimes very liberal, progressive understanding of theology and what we ought to be doing together.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense in terms of like how the particular expression of Baptists that you're a part of, the Denom Network, would relate. Do you have any kind of relationship to other churches in the area or other denominational churches, or have you found like other Christians outside of that denomination having any kind of interest in what you're up to, positive or negative?
Well, I mean, I get like Twitter messages or like emails in response to my newsletter pretty regularly from colleagues or just other ministers that are kind of burning out all the time, basically, or that read about what we're doing as a church. And I don't say that as like a way of, I'm not trying to like brag, like a bunch of people are into what we're doing. Locally, at this point, we're just trying to like get off the ground, I mean, we're still a small church. Like it's still like 40 people that show up on a Sunday, which is not a small thing, but it's not huge. It's not a big deal. So locally, it's mostly me and the ways that me and Kevin and Heather, the two co-pastors that I work with, just the relationships that we have with other pastors. But as of right now, I mean, we're just kind of like trying to build up our church and make it into a thing. And that, I mean, it's really exciting and it's fun. And I'm looking forward to the ways that leads to conversations and ways that we relate to other churches outside of us. But right now it's just kind of like figuring out what our life together looks like.
Well, that's cool. I mean, 40 people. It's more people than go to my church. Well, let's talk about the debt stuff that you guys have going on. I think that's really cool. So, yeah, one of the things that makes your church really stand out is its approach to debt and paying off loans. It's a really important ministry, and I think everyone needs to know about it. And I want every church to do it ever, retroactively even. So can you say maybe a few words about like what it is that you're doing, why you're doing it? Is there like a theological motivation behind it, or is it just like undercover Marxism or something?
Yes. Well, no. So, okay. So like practically speaking, we have in our budget, we have a debt liberation fund, and so each month once a month we pay off somebody's debt. And so far that has been church members. And we do that in worship, and we do that by handing them when people ask, like, how do you do that? I'm like, well, we just write a check and we hand it to them. Like, it's
seems pretty straightforward.
The nice thing about debt is it's incredibly simple. I think maybe I said this the last time I was on the podcast, but it's actually like it's a very simple, straightforward thing. But we do that. So we have a debt liberation fund out of which we pay for people to get out of debt. We start with church members. We focus on church members, but we're not exclusively doing that. So we've looked at debts that are in the sort of $4,000 to $6,000 range. So the first one that we paid off was a $4,700 credit card debt held by a member. I think it was a 29% interest rate. That she took out took out a lot of it when to pay for insulin and like diabetes medication. And working full time, but in the situation where working full time, the paycheck just evaporates, and like is not falling behind on payments on anything, but is right on the edge. And so we have an application process. So people they just fill out an application that is anonymous to our cooperative council, who's they're the ones right now that oversee that application. But then we literally hand them a check in worship. And so we have a liturgy, and I'll send it to y'all, and maybe we can post it on the website, post it on wherever. But yeah, so after the sermon, as we move into communion as a church, on those Sundays there is a liturgy where the church makes commitments to the person whose debt's being paid off. They receive that gift. And then as we move into communion, they are one of the people that serves communion that Sunday. And so we did the first one. It was someone paying off a credit card. They've all been credit cards because they're kind of the easiest, the highest interest, because they're just awful, and like a $4,000 to $6,000 credit card debt I have one that at 25% interest is an awful thing. And that's kind of what we can do as a congregation. But the larger, I guess the larger sort of theological underpinning of it is that we have to liberate each other. So one of the ways I feel is we're not doing this to go help people outside the church. We're doing this because this is all we have. This is the only institution that we are going to be able to help each other. And if you're here and you're a member and you're giving to this church, not that you have to give to the church to get these things done, but that we're giving to this church and we're being a part of this thing, and that means certain commitments to one another. And for us, that's an exposure of capitalism. That capitalism exploits us in ways that aren't necessary, and that we could actually do better otherwise. And so that's part of the reason we do this publicly. A lot of churches will pay off debt either for people outside the church, or will pay for things for people in need, either inside or outside the church, but it's always kind of secretive. And for us, it's no, look, we realize this is a problem you're dealing with, and it's not your fault. and so we've got to do it together. So we do that, and so it brings me so much joy to do it. And so we the first one was the credit card for diabetes medication. We did 2 in October. One was for a guy who was working his way through college over like a decade, basically, and then lost his job his last few years while he was in college. And the other one that we paid off at the same time that Sunday was a woman on disability who took out credit card debt to pay for groceries. And it's put me into conversations with people that I've deeply enjoyed in a way that I enjoyed, or like it's opened up things for me in terms of pastoral ministry that I didn't think I didn't know were possible.
Yeah, I mean, I really admire the whole situation, because I mean, I've been a part of like a church board of directors for a minute, and sometimes we have situations that come up where someone needs money in our community or whatever, and we always have to have these like really long and drawn out ad hoc decision making kind of conversations where it's like, well, do they have the right social services? Are they like plugged into all these places? Do they have a job? All these kinds of like large sort of grandiose ways of answering the problem. But you guys just have like a really straightforward way of making decisions about how to give people money, and I think that's like that's one of the most important things. I don't know, just that it is like, so it is a straightforward problem, and you guys have a very straightforward answer, and there's no sort of like hemming or hawing about it. You just have a way to make a decision about how to give people money, and then you do it. It's, I think, a really good thing.
What you're saying sounds like a pretty prophetic thing to do, John. This is my extremely ham-fisted way of transitioning us to start talking a little bit about how this relates to this Sojourners article that you had recently written. And I mean, we can and should keep talking about this in this context, but I think this is just a really nice way of like framing this. So you wrote this article, Sojourners, about a false binary between prophetic and pastoral ministry. And it's a great article. You talk about this weird balance of saying something radical and also then having to say something comforting, or having, a sort of division of labor in a pastoral team, which probably people have heard about if they spent time in like evangelical spaces in particular. I have anyway. But you say, quote, "In an age of such drastic income and wealth inequality, what makes something prophetic or pastoral often boils down to how rich people feel about it." Which you then go on to say is maybe a bad metric for thinking about these things. So how do you think capitalism has shaped how pastors and congregations think about their ministry, but also their own lives, their own debt, in terms of things like this, right? Like saying something prophetic or saying something pastoral, so-called. And how are you and other pastors trying to change those habits at Jubilee?
Yeah, that's a quote that a number of people pulled, and I don't know that I thought it was. I mean, I guess I thought it was kind of the crux of the piece. I mean, for the listeners that haven't read it yet, what I was trying to get was, I mean, a lot of what I write is just me being annoyed at what I'm like being told about how things should be, and assuming it's wrong, and then wanting to figure out why. And so it's a pretty short, I mean, it's a relatively short piece. The idea is that, for those of us that work in ministry or that are a part of a church, is that, like there's this idea of like there's pastoral ministry, which is things like going to the hospital, getting coffee with people, comforting them. And then there's prophetic ministry, which is often times characterized as like a social critique or criticism, and so that's like sermons about social justice and all this stuff, and like and that you're supposed to balance these two. And I, like for me, it just comes down to what counts as comfort in criticism is very oftentimes dependent on who's who's hearing it. The idea that, like, you know, wealthy, the wealthy exploitative people of the world, that their souls are endangered. Like, I mean, that's, for most of human history, that's been deeply comforting to the poor. Right? Like, that's, I mean, and so trying to flip those two around, like, that's what I was trying to get at. Like, why do we assume that, like, what is pastoral and what is prophetic has to be about criticism or comfort? And I mean, it's not easy to actually do. It is. Well, I mean, it is easy to sit with somebody that's in poverty and describe, like, why they are in poverty in terms of the you know, the gross imbalances of power and injustice that exists in our society. It's way harder to sit with people who have benefited from that and to explain that in a way that's, like, pastoral. Does that make sense? And like, I don't know what to do about it, because I'm at a church where, like, those things are all kind of flipped, and it's very, very difficult to think about how to reorient. Like, what would we do? What people listening to this that work in churches, like, what would you do if you didn't have to worry about the 10 wealthiest people in your church? Which is what, like, almost everybody has to do. And that's usually how these terms get oriented, right? Like, what's pastoral and what's prophetic gets oriented around how the top 10 wealthiest people in the church will respond to things.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I'd be curious to hear more about when you say something like, when you make a suggestion as a pastor that you should be reading, let's say, Herbert McCabe, or, you know, you were saying to us earlier that you've been reading some Marx together. You know, what is that like in a congregation that is, like, intentionally set up to be prepared to hear that as something that's not, you know, completely off the wall? Like, I guess I can't really personally even imagine being in that sort of situation. So I'm just curious about how that is shaking out in what you all are doing.
Yeah, it's been a weird year. It is very strange. Like, pastoring without resistance, or without a whole lot of resistance, I should say. And I don't know what to do with that. And we're like, I guess we'll get it figured out, and then we'll just try to, you know, we'll start. We've joked at the church that we're going to start the Acts 2 network. You know, instead of the Acts 29 network, which is like Mark Driscoll's thing, which is like, you know, Acts, the book of Acts ends at the 28th chapter, and his whole thing was like, Acts 29, we'll just plant these churches as a continuation. And our thing is like, let's just start the Acts 2 network, where we just go back to where everybody shares everything, and we'll just do that, and let's just see if that works. No, it is really, really bizarre to pastor and to be a pastor to people that, like, are ready to go on these things, that are willing to read. So for listeners that don't know, we have a financial literacy class that just concluded tonight when we're recording this, in which we read Karl Marx, and we read Marx's Capital in order to understand what's happening to us, which is, like, kind of a weird thing for churches to do. And I don't know how it's going to play out. I mean, for us, so I'm the co-pastor of missions and outreach, and so for me, thinking about missions, it seems like missions should be solidarity with working class people, both inside and outside our congregation. We have a couple congregants that are organizing in their workplace right now, or moving towards more militant organizing in their workplace if they already have a union. But that feels like uncharted territory, at least for especially churches in North Carolina, because the labor movement is so weak here. But that's where it feels like it should lead us to maybe answer your question. Like that's the most obvious, like, first spot is, every member of our church should understand that they should organize in their workplace, and if they feel scared to do that, they should know that their church has their back.
I mean, it sounds a lot like we've talked about the labor church, or the tradition of the labor church, on this podcast in the past. Examples where, especially in the early 20th century, pastors who were getting shoved out of their congregations for speaking against capitalism, and then congregants who felt alienated by their pastors who wouldn't speak out, found a way to come together. In some cases, pastors going right down to picket lines and saying, let's start a church right here out of these striking workers. And the church becomes a vehicle for exactly that, right? For collecting people who are organized and organizing and reproducing that sort of thing. Do you guys see yourself in that kind of tradition, or do you just mentioned this is kind of uncharted territory? Do you see this more as kind of like, I guess, piecing these things together ad hoc, just as they had to do, 100 years ago or something?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, at least as I see it, it's uncharted in that, like, our goal is for our church to be right there with striking workers, and also for the members of our church to be learning how to organize and strike. And so I don't know. It's really, really weird. Like, I don't know what to do with it. I don't know where it's going to go, because we have a couple church members that are very actively organizing their coworkers right now. We also are being asked to participate and support and stand in solidarity as a church with organizing workers. So I don't know. I don't know that the two are mutually exclusive, but it does seem like what's happening and what we need to give an articulation to. And this is where I'm really excited like writing, and I like giving a voice to where I think things are headed. Like understanding why it is that we're doing this and how we're going to go about doing it and what that looks like. And so that's kind of what we're working on. So, like, our missions for the next year is going to be solidarity with and as working people, which about a year and a half ago, missions at the church I was working at was Operation Christmas Child. So that's a pretty cool, that's like a cool move. That's like a pretty fun.
It is. It's good.
Yeah. It's a hop, skip, and a jump from Franklin Graham to, I don't know who the next. Maybe I'm the Franklin Graham of the left. That'd be pretty fun.
Yeah, that's you.
Someone has to be.
It is
someone has to be. We come up with Christmas boxes that go to striking workers.
I would give my money to that.
Yeah.
It is really interesting, though, because, like, what you're doing is not super different than, like Dean said, the labor churches, 100 years ago. But, like, the situation, the context is significantly different, and just also that there's no infrastructure. The labor movement is in a whole different place. I don't know. It's similar, but what you guys are doing is uncharted in the sense that there's no other churches like you, I think, I mean, if there are, let me know, and I'll go. But it seems pretty unique at the moment, at least. Well, I
think that's right, and I think that's where. So there is a sense of like that I have. Love Heath Carter in his book, which listeners should have read it, but if they're new to the podcast or whatever, like definitely read that. And recognizing that there is a history to all these things, but it's not super pertinent right now, or like it's been destroyed, and defeated for like a long time. And so I mean, even like as we're creating this kind of plan for missions about supporting labor and labor organizing and organizing workers, I'm thinking about it from the standpoint of like, what do in a year when we have like a half dozen church members that are organizing their coworkers, when we are showing up to picket lines and strikes, like what is the thing that what do I want the sort of rationale and practical plan to be that people can go to when someone says, well, why are you doing that? And they look to it and go, oh, that makes sense. Which wasn't a thing you had to make 100 years ago in churches that were in the midst of these labor. I mean, they might have come down on the wrong side, but there was at least like a rationale for one way or the other.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? And that's what I'm trying to and it's so weird. It's very, very strange to try to figure out like, oh, how do I rationalize the sort of end of supporting organized labor in a situation in which organized labor, I mean, North Carolina, I think, has the least, it's South Carolina is the least unionized state in the country, and then North Carolina is second. And it's like 2% to 2.1 or something like that of workers are in a union.
Yeah.
And we're hoping to get that up to at least 4 to 5.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what impact you guys make. I mean, I can't imagine it would be insignificant. Well, let's shift gears really quick here because we don't have a whole lot of time left. But speaking of you, John, being the next Jerry Falwell of the left, it's a good idea.
Transition.
Yeah. No, let's talk about the Falkirk Center. So, in case you haven't heard out there, Jerry Falwell and Charlie Kirk started their own center at Liberty University in order to win over the hearts and minds of young Christians who've been indoctrinated by socialist ideologies by, quote, weak-kneed and feckless churches.
So, you hate it when your church doesn't have enough feck.
My church is all out of feck. My church
go to a feckful church.
You need a church with strong knees. But John, as a pastor who is actually doing this kind of thing, indoctrinating people with socialist ideologies, what's going on with the Falkirk Center? Why are they doing this?
Well, I've got a lot of ideas. First of all, I love that if you Google the Falkirk Center, the first hit is what appears to be some sort of like bed and breakfast or something, like some. It's
I can do this right
it's
now.
It's definitely not the Liberty University think tank, and let's put think in scare quotes.
Yeah. Think is doing a lot of work in that that phrase.
Ultimately, what they're doing is they realize. Well, I think Charlie Kirk is getting protested by the farthest of alt-right people, and so like if people go and look up, like he and Donald Trump Jr. were on some sort of book tour, and they got like heckled off stage but it wasn't by like the libs. It was by the most alt-right people. So I think that's just super funny. And so I kind of wonder if this whole thing is just an easy way to get him a paycheck and to have like a millennial come in and just assure a bunch of boomers, a bunch of well-off boomers that they're that like, oh, there are millennials out there that are in favor of capitalism, and there definitely are, but it's not cool. Like that's
most importantly,
it's not cool to be like, oh yeah, Jeff Bezos, that dude rules. Like that's fucking awesome, like, and so I think that's part of it. I don't know. I think it's so funny. I also think it's a way to get like media credentials, because Liberty University is like a big deal. I mean, it's like one of the biggest schools in the country, based on online students. That gives some credentials to get people on TV to go out and combat socialism is basically their thing. But they have, there's some great quotes about like, I'm pulling up. Charlie Kirk said, young Christians are becoming increasingly Marxist in their political leaning. The Falkirk Center will seek to educate the public about the indispensable harmony between natural rights and the gospel of Jesus Christ, while rejecting the secular agenda of the left. So that's kind of that's what they're after. And to my knowledge, they haven't even heard of Jubilee Baptist yet.
They will soon. I think
so, which is also kind of terrifying.
It could be the best thing that ever happened to you, though. You never know. We've been very carefully, Matt and I, the last several days, just been doing some really good media journalism by following the Falkirk Center Facebook page and directing our friends to go to it and leave bad reviews. And I am happy to report that it is now 2.8 stars out of 5. And that is down from the 5-star rating it had before this. So that's great. So that at least kind of confirms, I think, your suspicion that this is basically nothing so far.
Yeah, well, okay. So the website, the website, and this, so Liberty University is a multi-$100 million. It is one of the biggest universities in the country. And the website for the Falkirk Center, which is a think tank under Liberty University, is just a picture of Charlie Kirk and Jerry Falwell Jr. doing a thumbs up in an office.
You gotta love it. It's so good.
That's the entire website. Like that's it. They couldn't roll. Yeah, it has all of the makings of like of a sham, of just a grift. Like, just get some rich donors to give some money to let these guys post and go on TV.
I think so too. In the 1950s, this is like a weird deep dive, but in the 1950s, there were these like, I don't know, business people, business organizations. They were doing this like research just to kind of gauge like how the public felt about business people. And business people, I think, historically are universally hated. Even if you're not a socialist, people just like don't trust them. They don't think of them as like, you know, prestigious or upstanding people in society. Anyways, the results of these surveys in the 50s would always be, they're like Pew Research studies and stuff. They're always that like people don't really care about business people. They don't think they're very serious. They don't think that they contribute anything to society. An overall bad brand for business people. So in response in the 50s, this is when like when people like business people from different, you know, big companies, they would give money to universities, state universities for sure, but Christian universities particularly, to like start different types of think tanks and curricula to try to raise the prestige or raise the brand of business people in amongst their students, right? Because, if students favor socialism, or if they think, that business people are bad, it's less likely that they'll be business people, that they'll sort of perpetuate their own ideologies. But to me, this is it seems like this is in that vein of thing. Like, that's what they're trying to do, right? Like, they want to make sure that Christian students don't become socialists. But this is the worst attempt I've ever seen at it in my entire life.
Right? Yeah. So yeah, that's what I can't figure out is who are they hoping to convert and how?
Yeah.
And that's where if you actually look at the website, it's actually just a bunch of rich people paying for Charlie Kirk to go to the meme factory. That's what they want. It's not, they're not offering classes. They're not, because the Koch brothers are doing all that stuff.
Yeah.
There's nothing, they're not engaging anybody in any real way. And they say this as they talk about the launch of this think tank, is that it's about the social media blitz about this stuff, that all these young people are going to socialism, and so we need to combat that. But it makes no sense if you are under the age of 40. No, if you're under the age of 55 and just online. I think it makes a ton of sense if you're 62 and already a donor. You're oh yes, yeah, go get them online. Go aggressively fight for capitalism online. I will support whatever thing you're doing. And I just think it's so funny. Because it's not like they're going to put out a think tank. They're not going to put out policy papers.
Right.
Right?
In fact, so they are so not going to put them out that that is something that a person in this article I found, Jenna Ellis, an ambassador for the Falkirk Center for Faith and Liberty, had said explicitly. She says, ironically, in a digital age with metadata at our fingertips, she really sounds like she knows what she's talking about. People are lost when it comes to politics, policy, and current events. Falkirk Center is designed to engage socially and politically using the same tools that the left has been employing, social media. And she says explicitly, people aren't going to look at policy papers. This quote, by the way, comes from a CBN article, Christian Broadcasting News.
Right.
And the title of this article, which I love, is Powerful Duo Starts New Venture. Judeo-Christian Principles Take on Secularism, Socialism. So there you go. They've got at least one other person, and that's Jenna Ellis, their ambassador.
That rolls, and also that sounds exactly right, which is that the people they are trying to appeal to don't give a shit about actual policy papers or understand any of this stuff. It really is just about creating memes and being online and owning the libs. And I welcome it. I'm excited to, I hope that Jubilee Baptist proves an interesting foil for them. Because who gives a shit? What are they actually doing other than justifying the wealthy and powerful? That's it. That's our whole job. And they're trying to make that sound cool and interesting.
Totally. In the 70s and 80s, the Walton family, they gave a lot of money to Christian schools like John Brown University to start initiatives to import students from Latin America and Central America to teach them about business, so they could go start Walmarts in their own countries or whatever, and also to kind of as an anti-communist initiative. And that was at least a well-funded and well-orchestrated devious plot. But this is just a Facebook page with less than 300 people liking it.
Right.
And a bunch of them
this
are
is
us.
just Jerry Falwell Jr. Jerry Falwell Jr. has the charisma of a styrofoam cup. That's the other crazy thing. Is he's not even you just we got the Judeo-Christian value. It's Jesus and Jefferson. We're out here talking. Jefferson, he had a house out in Lynchburg. Most people don't know that, but he had a house out in Lynchburg, and so he was. When you combine those values, those are the eternal values. And he's like, what are you talking about? Like, he is. It is unhinged when you watch him talk about this, and it's obvious that like it's a joke. The whole thing is a joke.
I feel like I need to rebrand as a person who
like it's an easy way to make a lot of money. I mean, my question is like, are they gonna teach a class on how to do land deals with your personal trainer and an 18-year-old pool boy in Miami?
No.
Like, is that part? What are the Judeo-Christian values that inform that? That would be an interesting.
I feel like I need to rebrand as a person who's just all about values, all about Christian values, and how socialism is just one of those values. Working people, it's just it's something I really value. It's something a lot of good people value. And just if you say value over and over again, if you say it enough times, I think you can hypnotize an entire audience into giving you a lot of money. That's what I'm learning.
I mean, do you think there is an angle to this that is like? I mean, these guys are the grifters of this. But, like, there is an angle to it that I think is a little bit scary. And, like, the Know Your Enemy podcast, which with friend of the pod, friend of your pod.
Yeah.
Matt Sitman. In that, like, the right is figuring out a kind of populist language. I think the Falkirk Center is a weird and bad attempt at this, but I do think there is something going on the right of like a recognition that like people are very, very scared, and that people recognize that something is antagonizing them. And I do think something like the Falkirk Center, they're just trying to capitalize on that sense of being under attack and that sort of thing. But that's like real. I mean, it's not going away.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we don't have a lot of time left here, but John, I think that you do definitely have what it takes to be the Jerry Falwell of the left.
He is the champion of the Detnico Center.
That's true. We're giving you an honorary degree right now.
Well, I'd like to end on a more hopeful note than what I just said, which is that like while I do think there are these like goofy iterations of it, of the Falkirk Center, that are recognizing the contradictions and failings of capitalism to provide for people to, be good in the ways that it promises to be. I see a lot of people, and to sort of your podcast and our conversation, I see a lot of Christians that are like questioning capitalism in a real way, and that's why I think that. Yeah, the Falkirk thing is definitely a grift, but what I think it's a recognition of is that, like, yeah, we're encountering some real problems that have always been there, have always affected people. They've especially affected minorities, women, LGBTQ people, but they've also affected them because of their being working class. And so we're in a moment where like those crises are really, really real, and they're stretched really thin, and people are trying to figure out what's going on. And so what you see with something like the Falkirk Center is the ruling class trying to figure out how to make sense of that for the ruling class in a way that they can just make some money. But there's most people are just really dissatisfied with how things are, and they're really upset. And there's an opening there for, I think, both Christians and a working class movement. That we'll see. I don't know what that will lead to. I think that opening is there.
Yeah,
and I don't think Charlie Kirk or Jerry Falwell Jr. have the answers that anybody cares about, and so it'll be interesting to see what we can do about organizing people and giving them an answer as to what it is that's actually causing those problems in life and what to do about it.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. That's a good way to put it. That's that real Jerry Falwell of the left energy we all need right now.
I should have, I should have mumbled a lot more. He sucks so bad at talking.
It's incredible. He's so bad.
It's really amazing. He's really, and that's, yeah. They talk about, like, his brother got all the charisma, but he got all the, like, political capital.
It's a meritocracy. What can you do?
That's it. Yeah.
Well, thanks for coming back, John. And we look forward to having you again in the new year to find out what 2020's theme ought to be as we welcome a new decade into this world.
Sounds good.
Big one.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks, John.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/the Magnificast. You can also follow us on Twitter, twitter.com/Magnificast. We even have a secret Facebook group called the Magnificast Basement. You can jump in there too if you want to. Cool. Well, thanks to Amari Armstrong for the cool intro music, and thanks to the Logical Spoon for the outro music. All right, y'all. See you next week.
Church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon.